So this really puts a heavy toll on the health workers. You find maybe a nurse or midwife has to provide treatment to about 100 patients. When you look at the children's ward, it's full of malaria. So this impacts on the quality of care that she can provide, because most times she's alone and the cases are so many. So she may not be able to provide the quality of care she would like to provide. The other example I want to share is Ebola. So a few years ago, 2021, 2022, we had an Ebola outbreak. And of course, with climate change, we are seeing that these outbreaks are going to happen more and more. Yeah. So during this outbreak, we had about 164 cases with about 30% case fatality. I want to share a personal story of someone I knew, a health worker, an emergency health worker who was responsible for evacuating suspected cases from the community. And he was very diligent, but through his work, he contracted the disease. And unfortunately, we recognized it late, and we lost him. So sorry to put a bad mood on, but I wanted to bring the impact of how health workers are losing their lives because of these challenges. So had this health worker been equipped with the right protective equipment, with the right training, the right knowledge, and also if there were more people, maybe wouldn't have been so tired and forget to wear maybe gloves, still be here with us and be able to provide that he was to. So these are the impacts in Uganda.
Well, thank you, and thank you for sharing a personal anecdote and moving. And we know that kind of example is far from isolated, unfortunately. And we appreciate how brought to the fore an impact and the in lives and in well-being, also the economic impact that these types of challenges are confronting and that are over time. And one of the things that was health strengthen in order to panel out and in the might see research that we did exactly on this topic, ensuring greater sustainable healthcare, making them more climate resilient. Those of you who are tuned in on our website, but it serves as a perfect to what was going to be my was for you, Darren. You have worked for decades of roles and institutions and contexts. So, from your experience, really trying to lead that effort, how do we health systems, as Irene see, and change to meet the reality we're already facing?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you. And thank you for as an illustrative panel. Nice introduction too. I think there's a lot of talk, as we've heard, around more upstream impacts and mitigation efforts really around climate change and the impacts of climate change on health. But as we've also heard, communities are dealing with the health impacts today, and they're having a huge impact on communities. And so the importance of community healthcare workers and emergency response systems just becomes even more important. From our perspective, when I think about the work that we do from the Pfizer Foundation, we can't future-proof healthcare systems if they're not today-proof. And so that's where a lot of the work that we focus on really takes place, is going back to basics and really making sure that the fundamentals are in place, the people, the infrastructure, supplies, technology, so that we can fortify healthcare systems today in the right way, and they're context-specific, so that they can flex and respond and absorb impacts in the future. And I'd just like to build on a couple of examples, actually, and the great overview that we heard from Minister Chiponda of the work that we're doing in Malawi. Malawi, as you heard, has set forward a very ambitious plan with their National Strategic Plan for Health, which is very much focused on integration of services. which is really going to be key to fortifying health in Malawi. And so one of the programs that we have is working with the Ministry of Health and Seed Global Health. We're actually looking at that integration of services and what does that package look like? Where does it work? Where does it maybe not work so much? And then looking in 2 districts as a pilot, how can we then create a blueprint that's going to help inform the Ministry of Health what will scale and what will be effective in all 26 counties. And then the second example I'd like to bring up, and again, the minister really talked about this, is the impact of AMR. Now, this is inside and outside of Malawi. It's at the forefront for all of us, specifically with climate change, when we think about loss of diversity, when we think about, severe weather impacts that come with climate change. And for Malawi, for example, it's estimated that around 19,000 people die every year due to AMR. And so we're working with the government, and we actually announced last week a partnership both with the government and with bioMeriU, where we're actually looking at AMR at the hospital level. So we're working across the 4 national hospitals, looking at both diagnostics, but also stewardship in antimicrobial use. So it's diagnostic stewardship and antimicrobial stewardship. And then how can we link microbiology to the decisions that are being made in terms of appropriate use of antibiotics? And this is going to have a huge impact not only on health delivery today, but when you think about some of the emergency situations and how Malawi had to respond to cholera, for example, as an example there.
Yeah, that's a great example, and just to unpack it a little bit, I'm listening to you speak, and I like how you kind of talked a little bit about the stages of healthcare. When we talk about making it more resilient, what are we ultimately talking about? And you underscored the importance of detection and diagnosis, but also of treatment and response, and AMR being a challenge that certainly is not unique to Malawi, unfortunately, and spans across the globe, and is one of the most pressing global health and health security challenges that we face. So even where we are making the detection and diagnosis systems and tools more climate resilient, we have to make sure that the response and treatment is equally so. But the other thing that you highlighted, and that Irene, you also touched upon, was of course the role of partnerships. And we know that no one stakeholder or player can do this alone, and that lifting tide will be needed. And so Naveen, I'd love to bring you into the conversation at this stage. And you lead the Rockefeller Foundation's work on global health. The Rockefeller Foundation has been doing this kind of philanthropic investment and support and partnership for more than a century at this point. So what do you see as some of the innovative financing strategies that foundations and governments and civil society partners could explore to effectively fund climate and health in tandem, and not one at the cost of the other?
Good morning and thank you. In the spirit of full disclosure, I'm a physician, and I went to medical school because I was not good with numbers or math. And now I'm reformed because I realize that in order to get global health outcomes, you do need to focus on financing. And at the end of the day, that is the fuel for the fire. And that if you're not good at financing, you're not going to achieve your objectives. So kind of a reformed doctor speaking here. So if I were to look at what is the problem statement, why is there a barrier? Why is climate health adaptation seen as a lesser cousin to mitigation? It's the poorer cousin, lesser cousin. And there are a couple of barriers to that make this gap widening. In fact, they believe it'll be around 400 billion deficit by 2030 in developing countries. Basically, we don't have good information. We still don't even know what is the cost of inaction. We haven't documented that. These structures for financing are complex. They usually, there's not a single measure of value, or how do we even measure adaptation results, and how do we make those exciting and interesting for the partners to come in. So there are a couple of barriers, and so if we start with the basics, Rockefeller worked with Global Fund, Green Climate Fund, WHO, and COP28. And last year at the Health Day, we helped launch the guiding principles for financing. So that's the basic. We need guiding principles, and that was very well accepted, and that liberated about $1 billion in commitments. And then we realized that is the start. We needed to then come to financing and then innovative financing. And so how I want to build the rest of my comments, which are going to be brief, is there's a primary stack. I mean, if you were to stack the financing, at the bottom of that would be primary debt, equity, grants, your traditional financing. And imagine, this is a doctor speaking now. On top of that, we needed to put innovative financing. And there's basically 3 innovative financing instruments out there that have multiple examples. If you go on the net, you will see that these are all being used, some within health, some on other sides, other industries, but we need to be able to learn from them and pick up and drop. The first one is disaster risk instruments. These disaster risk instruments provide quick liquidity and debt relief when there is a climate catastrophe. Now, you heard Minister Chiponda say that there was a day when she's floods and people are dying and she's got this 100-page application form she needs to fill out. Can't we fill out that form ahead of time and have disaster risk instruments that will kick in if there is such a disaster? If we were able to have predicted the intensity of Freddie and what it would have done, then automatically that money is available rather than her having to fill out a form afterwards. So the insurance industry uses this. It's called parametric insurance clauses that say if a predefined event happens, then automatically the money is released. You could also have regional insurance pools that mitigate and get regional monies to come in, and so you spread the risk. You can also have catastrophic bonds that are same way that are come to help during catastrophe. And the last time is also debt relief clauses. Now, World Bank is moving towards this, where it's trying to broaden the scope of debt relief. So when these catastrophe events happen, then there is debt relief temporarily. There's a moratorium on repayments. So the idea is on disaster risk instruments is all about predefining and then those events triggering rather than waiting for the fire to happen and then expect people to ask for money. The second is catalytic instruments. Catalytic instruments is when you put on top of concessional funding, you put commercial funding. But now the commercial funders don't come in too easily because the return on investment, the risk. So when you look at risk and return on investment, we need to make it attractive to the investors to come in. These are the private sector, institutional investors. And to be able to attract them, you need to have these catalytic instruments, which basically say, for example, Rockefeller will use our balance sheet to say we will be the first grantee and that we will be guaranteed that these payments will be paid if for some reason they can't. So we are catalytic, and that over us, then the commercial interests come in, and then we either reduce risk or increase returns. So there's another way to get new money to come in an innovative way. And the last one, which I'm most excited, which is the most recent, is outcomes-based financing. And these are, for example, how can you force financing to go towards outcomes that are tangible and meaningful. And in this instance, I am very focused on global health outcomes. So how can I get money to actually go to projects that will give me good health? Examples here are debt for health swaps. That is, if you get a certain amount of health outcomes, then your debt is released. There is also fiscal credits you can get for health outcomes. So the bottom line is there is financing, and then there's innovative financing, and this is necessary to close the gap. And this is the only way we can get those partners to come in with new money, more money, because we need it on the adaptation side. So that's my story right now.
I so appreciate you taking the time to break down those different types of instruments and their applications. You know, in so many conversations, there's a call to more financing and innovative financing, but there isn't often an opportunity to really get into what does that look like in practice, and how do different approaches address different challenges and opportunities. And one of the things that you were just touching on towards the end of your comment was about how to think about where improvements in health could then also lead to certain incentives for other types of issues. And I wanted to pick up on that and bring in another issue area that the Rockefeller Foundation has prioritized significantly for many years, and especially in the last decade, and that is related to food security. And when we think about food security and food sustainability, that's a health issue, malnutrition, certainly undernutrition, and all of that means for childhood health, for adult health, and the life course of a person. But of course, also its susceptibility to climate change and the very real ways in which climate change is undermining food sustainability. So how at the foundation are you maybe thinking about these two issues as relates to each other?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. It almost seems like I asked you to ask me this, but
we did. This is not. I promise it's not orchestrated.
It's fascinating you ask this. So we at the foundation, we realized that financing actually can incentivize good behavior. And so, for example, on the agriculture side, we are very focused on regenerative agriculture. How can we actually incentivize farmers to do regenerative agriculture where we are not stripping the biodome, we're not causing downstream problems, but how can we incentivize behavior to get cash crops and to get regenerative, where actually through that agriculture process, you're strengthening the soil and not depleting it. Similarly, how can we get cattle farmers to start moving towards more responsible cattle farming? And so there is a whole way of incentivizing, and this comes to a bit of the outcomes financing I was talking about, that you could actually drive good behavior by incentivizing through financing. And so it is being done, and there are a lot of good examples that give me hope. So in this doom and gloom story that we hear all the time,
yes,
I see the glass is half full.
That's fantastic, and I appreciate you taking us in that direction. Irene and Darren, I'd love to come back to you now and talk a little bit, building on what Naveen was alluding to, a systems approach, a systems-wide approach to addressing the dual challenges of climate and health, and making both resilient. And so my question is for both of you, and maybe Darren, I'll go to you first, and then Irene, I'll go to you first, and then to Darren. And that's about the role of primary health care. And where does strengthening primary health care fit into making healthcare systems more climate resilient, and also confronting and addressing how climate change is impacting health outcomes?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so I would say that, of course, as we heard from the Rockefeller, the issue is investment. We need to ensure that we put our money where our mouth is. If we need strong primary healthcare systems, we need to invest in them. And these don't operate in a vacuum. They are done by people, by health workers. So we need to ensure that health workers are invested in, they're trained, they're well-trained, they are recruited. In most of our facilities, we don't have health workers. We have 1 or 2 for a shift. They are, paid, and they're also protected. They're given everything that they need to perform their work very well, and also protect us. Because, you could come into the health facility, if the health worker is not protected, you end up going out with maybe a disease. So I would say that the issue we need to do is to invest in the health systems, but particularly the health workforce, which is, the backbone of health systems. And that also trickles down to primary health care. Thank you.
Great.
And I'll build on that, just to absolutely agree. It really is around the community healthcare workers, but also the community themselves. You heard the minister talk earlier about cholera, and I happened to be in Malawi soon after the cyclone and was visiting a community with a partner, and they were having their immunization program, but they were also dealing with COVID, and now they were dealing with cholera. And all these things are being thrown at these community leaders and community healthcare workers, and so it's really ensuring that the system is able to respond and flex to these changes, and particularly from a Pfizer Foundation perspective and just bringing the financing piece, what we found is really key is, direct investments right now are important because, as I mentioned, communities are dealing with these issues now, but also the flexibility in that funding as well, because we recognize that when we work with ministers, these things are changing day by day. So it's important that as an investor, we're able to be flexible in that financing as well, so that we can also flex and adapt.
That's great. As I'm listening to all three of you speak over the course of this discussion, and you play complementary but distinct roles and sit in very different perches, but I just want to go back to something that, Irene, you said at the outset, and I think is worth repeating, which is when we talk about healthcare workers, what we're really talking about is the front line of defense. That's the front line of defense in terms of health challenges, but it's also the front line of defense in terms of climate challenges, right? And at the end of the day, what are we really doing here? We're talking about people's lives, whether that's patients who are having to deal with disease burdens, or whether that's healthcare workers who are trying to deliver healthcare. It's about individuals, about families, about communities. That's ultimately what we're talking about when we talk about these issues. So I really appreciate all of you bringing your perspectives to this discussion, but then keeping us straight in terms of what's it all about. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your leadership, and I hope that you can continue to expand the work that you are all doing and do it well. So.